So before we dive into the content today, let me ask a question. How many of you today are using anxiety questions when you are in a sales situation? And I'm going to launch this poll and ask you to do this. We haven't really talked about what anxiety questions is, but just based on what you think today might be, I'm asking you how many of you use that today. And we've got a whole bunch of responses coming in, interestingly enough, and I'm going to kind of look at that. And as I get ready to close this poll and share the results, this is fascinating to me. I'm going to close it up, so take another 2 seconds. Make your choice, yes or no. Pretty simple, binary. No one's going to check your work here. But over 2/3 of you are using what you think is some sort of an anxiety question. And I think that's awesome. Often when we work with clients, this is one of the modules that many of our clients really appreciate, because the question they have is, what do you do when things aren't moving in terms of opportunity advancement or creation as quickly as you want them to? And what do you do if you have a prospect that is maybe even keeled, doesn't think they have to do something differently? And anxiety questions are our label or category of how we teach sales reps to do that. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's awesome. 71% of you are doing it. For some of us, it's incredibly uncomfortable to introduce anxiety into that sales call or that sales conversation. So today we're going to really talk a little bit about that. So let's kind of set the stage and the situation that we deal with. Anybody ever call on a guy that looks like this? We kind of call this the godfather of all prospects. They know it all. They have all the power. They're not sharing any information and insight. And what do? At the end of the day, sales is a communication process, but the most important part of that communication is getting the prospect talking to understand where they're at and where opportunities might be. And so one of the reasons that anxiety questions exist in our world is because when we run into this guy, we still have to call on him. We still have to try to compete on them, whether he's overconfident or just thinks he's got it nailed. Some people might even call some of our prospects a little bit arrogant. Sometimes they don't even know what they don't know. Another situation that we often run into is we feel like we're making progress with an opportunity. We've determined and with the prospect and confirmed that they've also determined that there's a good fit for our product or service or whatever we have. But all of a sudden we've got so many people involved in the decision-making process, and it feels like we're running in circles and not moving forward in advancing those opportunities. That could be another kind of situation where anxiety questions might come into play. Not that we want to just walk away from those opportunities, but we want to determine different tactics and a different approach to maybe get forward. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk specifically about what I'm going to cover in the next 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll leave you some time with questions. And if you have questions, please share them in your Q&A tab, and Julie will also interject those as we go through this kind of conversation today about anxiety questions. So first and foremost, what is it? We're going to talk about what an anxiety question is, and we're going to talk a little bit about why they're important. We're going to also talk about some specific ways to create them, how your thought process can work to create good anxiety questions. We're going to talk about 3 to 4 specific opportunities or scenarios where I have found, and here at Value Selling Associates, we find anxiety questions can be very successful in creating and advancing opportunities. And lastly, we're going to talk about some tactics that we can use to improve, increase, and maintain our prospect engagement. Because a lot of times what I hear from prospects are, hey, everything was moving quickly and all of a sudden it's the quote unquote radio silence from the prospect. There's nothing. There's no engagement. I don't know what's going on, and he or she won't tell me what's going on. So while we can't completely mitigate and eliminate those scenarios, we're going to talk about 5 specific tactics that we can try to be preventive of those scenarios taking place. So before I get into an anxiety question, let me just do a quick recap on the 6 fundamental principles related to the value selling framework. Because when we start to think about anxiety questions, often the reason we need them is related to one of these principles. And I'll share with you exactly what I mean by that. First principle, straightforward. People buy from people. Sales is a communication process. With the types of products and services that you sell, you need to be effective at building, maintaining credibility, trust, and rapport with the decision makers that are involved in buying your products and services. And that is people interpersonal skills. We also focus on the principle of people need a reason to change. It would be awesome if the reason to change was they just hadn't met me yet and learned what I do and what my company represents. But that's not typically their reason to change. Typically, the reason for them to change is internal to their business, and we need to understand that to be effective. We talk about the principle, the product is in the mind of the buyer. We know that if prospects are thinking about big problems that they need to solve in their businesses, they probably are also thinking about what they need to do differently to solve those. So the product, in terms of what we talk about, is the prospect's view of what it's going to take to address that. And they have those solutions involved, and we need to collaborate with them to understand that and position contextually in that and sell them back the product they think they want. People make emotional buying decisions for logical reasons. Real quickly, this is the heart of value selling and how we get urgency and motivation. We need to build solid business cases with our prospects, and that business value is a customer-specific quantification process where they actually go through the analysis to determine that the investment in you is quote-unquote worth it, but also that the individuals involved need to be aligned to what we're doing, because people are people, and people are wired to make decisions, even business decisions, good, solid business decisions that align to what's important to them. The correct use of power is key, is clearly identifying and gaining, maintaining, validating access to the power to make the decisions and execute on purchases in our prospects is important, but also our power to commandeer and command resources within our company to demonstrate that we can do what our marketing department says we can do, which is really what sales is all about. And then last but not least, you can't sell to someone who can't buy. The reason I wanted to kind of retouch these principles before we dive into anxiety questions is because when any one of these things is fuzzy or not understood between the sales rep and the prospect, anxiety may be a tactic to get the prospect thinking differently. So one of the premises associated with value selling is that we believe questions lead to solutions and statements can be confrontational. So we don't believe that sales reps should go in and tell the prospects what to do and tell the prospects what they're doing wrong and tell the prospects how smart the sales rep is about their business. We do believe that sales reps should go in prepared to have specific conversations and ask questions to gain consensus and lead to solutions. So anxiety questions is our tactic to be that provocative, challenging mechanism to help the prospect recognize something they don't recognize when we initially begin that conversation with them. So let's talk about the whole foundation of questions. Number one, this is a research article that we found on Forbes a few years ago. And it talked about the fact that all sales reps that are high performers ask better questions. And here were some of their tips. And I'll just quickly go through these because I think they are so important in understanding how we can build relationship. But specific questions to prospects establish our credibility. I think the best sales reps are not only curious, they're authentic, and they're genuinely interested in the success of the individuals that they call on. And when we can demonstrate that through our questions, we build that credibility. Actions and behaviors speak louder than words. So let's talk about these anxiety questions. It doesn't matter what you sell. And I know we've got people on this phone that sell everything from chemicals to software as a service to business services at a myriad of different price points as you look at what you sell. When you are selling anything, unless you're in a renewal type situation, you are selling change. And when you're selling change, change by definition creates anxiety for people. And sometimes we need to tap into that anxiety and help people understand what the long-term positive impact of that change can be. But we are selling change. You are selling change every time you open up a new opportunity for someone to do business with your company. So what is anxiety? And let me also kind of set the foundation. We have people on the line from all different cultures. And value selling is successful at deploying our methodology and this specific tactic all over the globe in different cultures, and it does work. Now, we'll talk about maybe some of the subtleties of execution if you're in Asia versus Europe versus the U.S., but this is not, even though I'm an American, a U.S.-specific tactic. This works in sales because the scenarios that we're going to talk about are relevant all over the world. And the question is, when you have these scenarios, what are you going to do? You have to somehow help the prospect discover or recognize things that they might not recognize today. So that's why we use the word anxiety. It is really trying to get the prospect to recognize something that they might not be recognizing or acknowledging when we're having conversations with them. So we created this concept called the anxiety question. And the anxiety question is really designed to get the prospect to think about something that they're not already thinking about. It's really designed, the best answer to an anxiety question is, I hadn't considered that yet. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Let me think about that. Did I miss something? And that is really the whole key to using this specific type of question. Now, you don't always need them. That's the beautiful thing. Sometimes we have prospects that are open, willing, recognize that they have issues and challenges, recognize that they need to change to do something differently, recognize that they need to do something quickly in order to act, which results in urgency, recognize that they need to build good plans to make sure that they're on the same page and getting what they want from your services. When that happens, God bless them, anxiety questions aren't needed. But when it doesn't, the question is, what do? Well, that's where a well-placed, well-thought-out, well-prepared anxiety question may come in handy. So let's talk about a little bit more about what these anxiety questions are. They're really designed to get the prospect thinking, as I just mentioned. So first of all, what we want a well-placed anxiety question to do is kind of break that current thought process. And I'll talk a little bit about how and when we might do that and give you some examples. But for example, I have been working with a prospect who does not recognize the fact that he might be at risk to not achieve his revenue goals because of some upcoming competitive threats. And so I inserted some anxiety questions in him to get him think about if he doesn't change proactively ahead of the market, then he may be at risk to get left behind. And I have nothing to talk to him about if he doesn't think he needs to do something differently. So I want to break that current thought process. In the context of value selling, that could be to surface some business objectives or issues that they acknowledge could be at risk without moving forward and thinking about things differently. It could be about recognizing specific problems. Maybe they don't know the problems exist. Maybe they don't know the problems could be solved, or maybe they just don't, they recognize the problems, but they don't think they're important enough to solve. The next thing we want that anxiety question to be is thought-provoking. And I use that word provoke very purposefully. We want the questions to be thought-provoking, but we don't want them to be confrontational. We'll talk a little bit about that, because the whole goal is to reshape perspective, to get that aha moment in the prospect and get them to start to think about things differently. And ultimately, if we get them thinking about things differently, we have the opportunity to open an unexpected dialogue with that prospect. And when I say unexpected, I mean unexpected from the prospect's point of view. You know exactly where you want to take it, but where is it unexpected from their point of view? And last but not least, we want to be productive at moving them forward. So how do we do that? Well, we craft questions very specifically that focus on a couple of things. It could be the consequence or negative implication of not doing business with you, of not solving a problem the way you want to solve it, of not sharing with you what's going on in their organization, of not giving you access to and helping you partner with them to get access to the ultimate decision makers and all of them. So we want to think through, what is that consequence? What is that outcome? What could be that negative, unpleasant implication? And in many cases, it's the whole concept of inserting fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The first sales manager that I ever had way back when I was starting my career was a master at anxiety questions and inserting anxiety and tension into a sales opportunity and a sales call. And he believed firmly that all motivations stemmed from fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And if we could tap into that with the prospect, we would sell and win more than we would not sell and lose. And on the surface, his premise was great. However, remember I said that not everybody needs an anxiety question to recognize that they need to change. When you use anxiety questions with those people that are already willing to change, oftentimes all you do is annoy them. And so while this person was very good in certain situations, he also did not do well in others because he used anxiety every time and couldn't turn that anxiety switch off in his sales style, if you will, or approach. So let's talk specifically about anxiety questions. Before I go into that, Julie, do we have any questions that we want to address right now?
Hey, Julie, we just have one, but I think you're getting there from Claudia. How I don't want to annoy anyone. How do I know when to bring that out?
Sure, and we are getting there. So great. So sometimes the fuel of the value selling framework and the questioning cadence that we teach to execute conversationally is a balance of three different question types: open and probe and confirm. And we know that in executing our open and probe and confirm questions, we need to get information to create opportunities and understand. One of the ways that we know we need an anxiety question is when those prospects, when we ask those open and probe questions early on, don't give us any issues or problems that would make sense for them to evaluate our solution. But at the same time, we know based on our expertise of working with other companies and other industries, those problems probably exist. So one reason and one scenario that we would use an anxiety question is when we're not getting what we need through our standard open and probing questions, and we need them to think differently. And I call those prospects either they are overconfident or they're kind of even keel, like, hey, everything's good. Don't rock the boat. I don't need to change anything. And I know you sales rep are here representing work for me. So those could be two scenarios right off the bat. What we want them to do then is kind of think in your mind, what would be the consequence that they would have if they didn't have what I have? What could be the consequence if they did not have what I have? And how can I phrase a question to get them to think about that? So if you're selling software, what is the consequence of them not looking at your solution to the problems they have? So what if you continue to grow this business and don't have tools that scale in a cost-effective way to move forward? What if you miss an opportunity to leapfrog the competition with a more rapid engineering, rapid design process from those types of things? What would be the implication to you if leadership in the organization realized that you didn't jump on addressing a recognized problem as quickly as possible, and therefore the cost to the company went up significantly? So we want them to start to think about what some of those consequences are, and we need to understand what those consequences are to really be able to ask some of those good questions. And when we ask these questions, we really want to almost get that emotional response, like, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. Could I be at risk? Oh my God, could this cost me my job? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Ooh, am I not as smart as I think I am? How can I ask those questions that is going on in their minds to get that emotional response? So we call that tuning into the what's in it for me and getting that emotional response. Remember, people make emotional buying decisions for logical reasons. If I think this is good for me, I will buy it. And I will tell you all the logical reasons that I want to buy it. So one of the things that we do here at Value Selling is we talk to sales leaders day in and day out about how they're going to optimize and improve the sales productivity of their teams. And an anxiety question that we use when we have a sales leader that we might be talking to is, what's the implication to you? What's going to happen if you don't hit your revenue target this year? I know research tells me that in certain industries, technology being one of them, the average tenure of a chief sales officer or a chief revenue officer is 18 months. So I know if they don't make their revenue target this year, their boss is probably actively seeking their replacement. So this is a question that we often use. When I sold in technology services, we used a similar question because guess what? At the time, it was the same tenure for chief information officers. As a matter of fact, there was an article when I was in sales, and this is going back kind of far, selling in the technology space, where there was an article in a magazine that said CIO now stands for career is over. If you get that job, get your resume together, because you're moving on. So there are lots of personal fear, uncertainty, and doubt that we can tack into if I'm talking to someone who thinks, hey, got this, nailed it, don't need to do anything differently. Thank you, but I'm all set. This could be an example of a good anxiety question that I could use. What do I want to do? I want him to think about what could go wrong. Because if he starts thinking about what could go wrong, then I can open up a conversation and have a conversation about what could go wrong and help him diagnose what could go wrong and then ultimately prescribe how we're going to mitigate that and make sure it doesn't go wrong and make it right. So how do we actually create these anxiety questions? Well, one of the things, and I've mentioned it a few times, is we've got to think about what those consequences are. We've got to be very clear on the potential value we bring both to the individuals and the companies that we work with, why we have capabilities that we have, why doing business with us is important. Once we have that clarity, we can start to think about how we can ask those questions. So step one is really thinking about, what is that negative consequence? I sell training and sales methodology. One of the things that I talk to some of my prospects about is, what's the implication if you put everybody through a training process that is so complicated that no one will do it? That could be an anxiety question that I might ask in a competitive situation to try to reposition the simplicity and ease of execution and value selling versus alternatives. So I want to understand what some of those negative consequences might be. Then I dive into creating a question. If I need to, or if I can, I might reference some of that research or previous experience. As I said, average tenure of a sales leader is 18 months. I might document that and include that in my question. I might even ask a simple question for somebody who thinks that they are very even keel and have everything figured out. What if you're wrong? What if this is bigger than you anticipated to be? How are you going to make sure that you can accomplish what you plan in this dynamic world or whatever? So I create that question that is just very simple. The good news is I want that question to have pop. The bad news is you don't have to overthink it. It doesn't have to be it doesn't need to be a paragraph long. It is a quick question. It is literally a question that allows you to see if you can get them to think about something, be provocative, etc. And then what I do is I am automatically then follow that up with some sort of a positive transition based on their answer. We've done this before. Never fear. Superman is here. We've done this before. Can we talk about a little bit specifically about what you're thinking about? Can we talk about how you're going to mitigate the fact that this negative thing, this bad consequence, that you keep your job, that the company continues on the trajectory that it's on, whatever it is, but we immediately transition into an open-ended question to open that dialogue. And it's really that simple. Creating these anxiety questions is that simple. When I work with senior sales reps, this is something that, because of their industry expertise and tenure, they love, because they have the confidence that they can ask these questions without damaging the relationship. They have the consequence that when they ask these questions and open a dialogue, it furthers the relationship as opposed to damage the relationships, and gives them an edge in creating those opportunities. If you think about marketing today, often marketing is all targeted at raising anxiety in the prospect to get them to think that they need to act. Next time you're reading a magazine, either online or offline, look at all the ads. Oftentimes the ads are questions rather than statements about risk, consequence, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So one of the things to think about, and one of the reasons that we spend a lot of time on anxiety questions and why I think they're so important, is when you're in a sales call and things aren't going well, our natural biological, physiological response is adrenaline starts running through our body. And for those of you that know what happens when adrenaline starts running through our body, our brain shuts down in that wash of hormones of adrenaline, and we can't think as clearly as we want. So one of our premises is we must have these anxiety questions tested and prepared before we go into the meeting, because it'll be very difficult to come up with them on the fly in the meeting. And so one of the test points as you brainstorm what some of these questions might be would be, is it provocative? Does it actually lead to the opening the new thoughts that you want them to do? Does it focus on the future? Getting people anxious about all the bad decisions they might have made in the past isn't going to help you move something forward. You want to get them focused forward, all eyes in front, and thinking about what they can do about the future. And then last but not least, does it risk rapport? And when I say risk rapport, I mean, while we want to introduce fear, uncertainty, and doubt, there's a big difference between asking the question, on average, people in your role last 18 months, do you have a plan to make sure you exceed that average, to, as a question from, hey, are you worried you're going to get fired? Which could damage rapport, which could be considered insulting, and could ultimately get you thrown out of someone's office. So thinking through that question and shaping that. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in terms of some of the cultural nuances of how this goes, if we're talking about risking rapport, in certain cultures and in certain situations, before we ever get into these sales cycles, we need to have solid trust and credibility. So if you don't have rapport early, sometimes an anxiety question could be posed as confrontational. So if we're going to risk rapport, that does assume that we have that. In some cultures, it's important that anxiety questions be asked peer-to-peer. So a sales rep or someone with a sales representative, account executive title might never be able to effectively ask, in parts of Asia, a senior vice president anxiety question, because that would not be considered appropriate because of the social norms in parts of Asia. If I bring in my boss and have a peer-to-peer conversation, potentially that boss can ask that anxiety question. So there are places and cultures where we need to look at who executes these anxiety questions, but also really understand when to ask them is important. Because we don't want to, the last thing we want is to so tick off the prospect that he throws us out of the office and will never talk to us again. We want him to think, oh my God, that person's really smart. They're bringing insight and helping me think and challenge status quo differently. And I want to continue the conversation, not end it. So again, what does that mean about an anxiety question? Well, it should not be confrontational, but it should be educational, instructional. It should get them to think. It should be interesting, which means that oftentimes the biggest challenge to a sales rep is when they ask these anxiety questions is to make sure you provide enough time and space for them to answer. One of the things that we're always talking about, if selling is based on questions, make sure that you give the time and the space for someone to answer those questions. And if it's a thought-provoking question, there may be a pause. There may be an uncomfortable pause. And your best tactic in that is to button up and not talk and let them go in and do that. We've talked about the nature of being provocative, being challenging, focusing on kind of challenging that status quo. Remember, the purpose is to get them to recognize something they're not sharing with you. They might not be sharing it with you intentionally, but oftentimes they're not sharing it with you because they don't get it yet. One of the things that it can also be is knowledge and expertise based. So oftentimes just the fact that we're asking these questions and the way that I've been kind of sharing with you allows us to demonstrate our credibility in the space. And at the end of the day, no relationship is built without being respectful. And so, are you going to get fired is not a good question, or what are you going to do when you get fired? Or I even heard somebody once say, hey, if you don't think I am good for you, that's okay. When you get fired, I'll just wait for your predecessor and I'll meet with them. So those typically are not successful at moving forward. Remember, what we're trying to do is create an opportunity to move forward and convert it to a client. And people do business with people they like. I often say to sales reps, if you can't have a solid relationship during the sales perspective and they don't trust you, it's like marriage. If I don't trust you and like you when we're dating, I'm going to hate you when we're married. So we want to really think that through, whether that's a solid analogy or not. All right, so let's dive into now a little bit about a couple of scenarios of when to use anxiety questions. So I talked about the fact that anxiety questions can be used throughout the entire buying process. If you think of what a prospect goes through when they're making a buying decision for the types of products and services that you sell, these are kind of the questions that they ask them. Hey, why do I need to change? What's going on in the business that leads me to think about doing something differently? And what are the problems that I need to solve as a result of that? And then what solutions should I look at or consider to solve those problems and fix that business issue or impact that business issue? Maybe it's completely resolve the business issue. Maybe it's impact or make forward progress on that business issue. But that is what we call creating a differentiated vision match. Anxiety questions can be used to open a dialogue on any of those elements. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically than that. If I have a prospect that is telling me that they don't have a business issue that has problems that I can solve, I might use anxiety questions to open that dialogue about business issues and problems. If I have a prospect that thinks a solution that is so far different from what I have to offer is what they need to do, then I might use anxiety questions to get them to think about, is that solution really the best for me? In addition, once I've figured out what the fit is, what I need to do differently to solve those problems, I start to think about, hey, what's the impact of that? How am I going to build the case to justify this decision, both in my mind and if I've got corporate hurdles to jump through? That's that whole value conversation. I might be able to use anxiety questions to focus on value to create urgency. We'll talk a little bit about that. Power. Are we talking to all the right people? Are all the right people involved in this decision-making process? There are times when I am blocked from power where I might need an anxiety question to help identify or gain access to additional people to help me execute that ultimate decision make and win the deal. And then plan. What do we need to do to realize the value with the prospect? And if we focus them on value, then doing business with me is just a step, a means to get that end. And so we can talk about all different areas to do that. So first and foremost, the first place, and I just mentioned this, that we use anxiety questions is to create and begin to create this vision match. We use anxiety questions with prospects that don't recognize or acknowledge business issues or problems that we know are likely in the prospect's world but haven't been recognized or acknowledged. And without those issues or problems being acknowledged, then why would they ever care about our solution? So anxiety questions can be used to surface a business issue or problem from that perspective. Very common approach in using anxiety questions. Another place where we often use anxiety questions is when we have what I call identified the prospect has a competitive vision match. So I talk with a prospect, they tell me what they think they need to do to solve it, and when they describe that solution, it does not include me. That's a problem for me as a sales rep. And I want to get them to think about, if you don't want to do business with me, here's what could happen. I can use anxiety questions to break that competitive vision match and get them thinking about that maybe my solution should be considered or elevated in their thought as a way to do that. So, for example, I was working with a client who sells a SaaS-based solution, and they were in a company competing against an enterprise-based solution. And they couldn't get this particular customer at that particular time to acknowledge that a SaaS-based solution, cloud-based, SaaS-based solution, could solve their problems as well as the enterprise solution. So they had to break that vision match, and they did it with anxiety questions to get them to consider that there were capabilities, flexibility, and long-term goodness, if you will, in them considering a different way to do things than that person had originally thought. So anxiety questions are very powerful. If you have an inkling that you are in a competitive situation, either competing against status quo head-to-head, or sometimes even competing in the war for capital, which today we often have to do. Anxiety questions can also be used to create urgency. What do we do when they're like, yeah, love to do it, but give me a call next quarter. Give me a call at the end of the year. Can you touch base with me in a little bit? Oftentimes those are a brush off, but oftentimes it's because there is no urgency. Urgency stems from value. And so we can often use anxiety questions to refocus the conversation on value. Personal value would tap into that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Business value might tap into, am I asking a good business question about the risk of not achieving the business issue? I have a client that sells HR solutions, and a big part of what they sell here in the U.S. right now is compliance at both the state and federal level for all of the human resource type regulations that you have, from healthcare to notifications to employees to fair hiring practices. And they use anxiety questions really well when their opportunities seem to be stalling and there doesn't seem to be urgency, to reconnect that prospect to the risk of non-compliance. That risk could manifest itself in a lawsuit, in a penalty, hard dollars, real consequences to those executives. And when those deals fall out, they've got a whole arsenal of maybe a half dozen or a dozen anxiety questions that they have created that they can ask to refocus the conversation on compliance, as opposed to recreate and recast those timelines. So here's a great example of an anxiety question, and Steve Jobs writes about this in his book in terms of when Apple was coming of age early on in the first wave, when Steve Jobs was first at Apple, and they realized that they needed to grow up and they needed a real executive with real credibility to come into their company. They also realized that Apple was going to, Steve Jobs' vision was it was going to be a world-class consumer brand. And so in the early 80s, he found John Sculley and started interviewing John Sculley to join Apple. And John Sculley didn't want to come. He was like, he knew how to sell soda. Didn't know how to sell these little Apple computers with the wired mouse and didn't buy into the vision. And Jobs talks about his anxiety question that he used, and with this question opened up a dialogue, and we all know history that Sculley did join Steve Jobs for at Apple early on in the 80s for the first go around at Apple for Jobs. So let's talk real quick as we wrap things up today about just a couple of different ways that we can maintain engagement and momentum throughout the sales cycles. We talked about the fact that anxiety questions may be the only way that we can create an opportunity or create enough of a qualified opportunity to keep that opportunity moving forward. But we're going to talk just about a few things we can do proactively to maintain that engagement over time. And then we're going to go into some more questions. I've got a couple of things to share with you at the end. And please stay on to the bitter end because I do have an exciting announcement I want to share with all of you. So let's go through these real quick. As silly as it might sound, the number one thing that we can do is be prepared in all of our meetings. Be prepared with what our objectives are. Be prepared with the questions that we're going to ask to direct those objectives. Be prepared with an agenda item, and be prepared to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve in in those meetings. And then the second area that helps us do this is focusing on the prospect, not us. At the end of the day, everybody's motivated for their own reasons, and we need to understand the prospect and how to align to their needs and not expect them to always align to ours. Now, when they align to ours, God bless them. We love that. We will take that. We will work with that. But most times we need to flex and listen to them. Which begs listening actively. How do we listen actively? Well, first of all, I mentioned the value selling questioning process. A key component of executing value selling effectively is our ability to confirm what we understand and what we have heard from our prospects. And when we confirm, we are forced to listen actively. And ultimately, most of us have to take notes because we can't accurately reflect on that. So good note taking is still critical, and there's a lot of research out there on physically taking notes engages the brain differently from a recall perspective than typing and taking notes. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's what the research says. So physically taking notes is better than typing for recall and capturing it, and it's easier for the brain to engage. The fourth, and as silly as this sounds, I have been in a number of meetings where this does not happen, and that is never leave the meeting without another meeting. Have that scheduled as an outcome every time you make a sales call. It doesn't mean that it won't get canceled. It doesn't mean that it won't change, but it does mean that at least we've got that next engagement, and it's a mitigating factor to the radio silence. And then a key fundamental area that value selling works with our clients on is how do we create timelines, momentum to take action. And that is the crux of what value selling does with our clients. And so we teach sales reps the timeline isn't created at the end of the qualification process. No. The timeline is created at the very beginning of the process, and we start to lay that out and collaborate with the prospect to do that. And that demonstrates a level of professionalism that sets us apart from the competitive salespeople that are working with our prospects as well. So, in summary, and then we'll get into questions. And like I have asked, we do have a little bit of an announcement at the end, and I want to give you some insight to that. We've talked a lot about anxiety questions. Powerful tactic to have in your arsenal to help prospects talk about things they don't expect to talk about. Recognize things that they might not do, and sometimes knock them out of that even keel or overconfident buying mode. We talked about not only asking those questions and some specific scenarios to ask those questions, but what do we do with the response? We immediately transition to talk about that issue. So if we get them to recognize, I could be at risk, or maybe I haven't thought about everything, or oh boy, I could be in trouble. We want to then be the remedy and the solution and talk about that. So the anxiety question creates the wedge for us to open that dialogue in a different direction. And then we talked about some specific areas where we can use anxiety questions. Uncover the business issues and problems to begin with. Break that competitive vision match. When we ask those solution questions, and we sense that they think a solution, their view of the solution does not include us or does not put us in the best position to win, that is an awesome place to insert an anxiety question. Urgency and value. Great way to do that. And then one thing that we didn't talk about, but another key powerful place, if you think about that value buying process, when a prospect calls you and just wants to talk about what you have and how much it costs, and you don't have any understanding to their issues and problems, a well-placed anxiety question in that scenario could help you resynchronize the buying and the selling process. I am happy to tell you about everything that we have in order to maximize the short amount of time that you have to learn about that. Can we talk first about what's going on in your world so I can share with you only relevant information? So again, turning that around and giving them, hey, if I just start talking, I'm probably going to waste your time. Can we talk first about you? Great technique for resynchronization.